in a class I'm teaching. Nice to see you on a Thursday, Flavia. Cool. All right, well, let's get started, you guys. Hi, I'm Brian Gresco. Welcome to the Antibody, a quarantine reading series. It's part of LitHub's virtual book channel. Tonight is the 24th show this year and the penultimate show. In March, the Antibody launched with the intention of boosting spirits during quarantine with a dose of good literature and conversation. And at the time, I thought that it might last a couple of months. Optimistically thought it might last a couple of months. Foolishly thought it might last a couple of months. Had no idea it would continue through a summer of uprisings for racial justice and into a fall that's seen the pandemic worsen. And now, of course, to today's political instability, the last kick of an administration which seems intent on scorching the earth if it cannot own it. But I hope that in these unsettling days, you're continuing to take care of yourself, whether that means turning off the news for a couple hours, or going for a long walk to attune to the changing season, or just letting loose a primal scream in your pillow, whatever gets you through. I've got my whiskey. And for me, books have continued to be a balm, and I am so excited and honored tonight to be joined by three writers whose work has just been such a well of inspiration for me and comfort, not just this year, but in years past. Akhtar is here, and Nicole Krauss is here, and Jonathan Lethem is here. And before we open ourselves to their words, I hope that you'll join me in settling yourself in and getting cozy and taking a nice deep breath. Physically, you're where you are, but right now we are in this shared virtual space together. And while we are, I ask that you please keep your microphone muted. We don't have a stage, but we have a mic, and we are going to honor the authors when they have the mic, as each one will read for us for a little while. And at the end of the event, there will be time for Q&A, so get ready for that. I know there's a lot of writers in the audience, so get those craft questions ready, because you are in the presence of experts tonight. The chat is public, so you can show your appreciation of the authors. And please show your appreciation often and enthusiastically, please. Our first reader for the evening is Nicole Krauss. Nicole is the author of the international bestsellers Forest Dark, Great House, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Orange Prize, and The History of Love, which won the Soroyan Prize for International Literature and France's Best Foreign Book Prize. I will spare all French speakers out there my attempts to say that in French. Her first novel, which is wonderful, Man Walks Into a Room, was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book of the Year, and her fiction has been published in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, Esquire, and the Best American Short Stories. And her first collection of short stories, To Be a Man, is just out. So please get those keys clicking and your fingers tapping, and give a nice warm welcome to Nicole. Nicole, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here tonight, especially with Jonathan and Ayad. It's a pleasure. I'm gonna read from the title story of To Be a Man, which is the last story in the book. And let's see, how can I set it up for you? So this is a story that's told by a woman who, the narrator is a woman who's in her, she's in her middle of her life, and she's looking at many of the men who she's been intimate with in her life. So it starts with her father. The second section is about someone who she calls the German boxer, who is a lover of hers. The third section, which I'm going to read to you from, is about her friend, an Israeli called Rafi. And the last section is about her two adolescent sons. So the story is called To Be a Man, and here we go. Now they were on the highway. Oh, I should say, Rafi and the narrator have taken their kids for the day to a place outside of Tel Aviv. They're in Israel, to the Moshav where he grew up. Now they were on the highway driving home, and she was saying to Rafi that all week People had been telling her the most astonishing stories. She was not aware of having asked for these intimate and staggering stories about their lives, but maybe in her way she had been. Maybe she had the look of someone who was trying to work something out, something at once vast and fleeting, which could never be approached head on, but only anecdotally. The sea was going by turquoise in the passenger window. The kids were laughing or complaining. I told you the one about the chicken under the car in Lebanon, didn't I? Rafi asked. No, he hadn't, she said. She would have remembered if he had. Rafi might have been a dancer, but from the ages of 18 until 23, he'd been in the Sayeret Golani, an elite special forces unit known for the physical extremes demanded of its soldiers. To become a man in his country was to become a soldier. Being a soldier was the passage you had to go through, whether you liked it or not, on the way to becoming a man, though no one could exactly say when along that passage it happened that you stopped being a boy. The first time you fired your gun at a moving target, the first time you saw the enemy as an animal, or the first time you treated him like one. Like every other 18-year-old, Rafi had no choice but to enlist. But it had not been required of him to go through the grueling selection process to be chosen for the special forces, or the year of masochistic training that followed, nor had it been required after completing 3 years of necessary service to sign on for another 2 years as an officer. Yet it had always been Rafi's understanding with himself that he would serve in the special forces in a unit that would push him to the furthest limits of his physical and mental capacity, that he would become an animal, but a pure animal that operates on instinct alone, like the flying tiger that was a symbol of the Sayeret Golani, and which its commandos received during the induction ceremony in the form of a small metal pin. There would be a field of thorns, Rafi told her, and you'd have to cross it. And to do so, your mind simply had to refuse to consider the pain, to think only about getting across to make the pain irrelevant. Or there was Hunger Week, during which the recruits were not allowed to eat or sleep for 7 days. Each evening, the officers would make a barbecue next to the starving recruits. They would grill steaks, lay out a feast, and then they would say to the recruits, "Come, why don't you eat with us?" And if someone gave in to his hunger and ate, that was the end. Just like that, he'd fallen, and the same day he was sent back to the regular infantry. Once the officers gave out chocolate balls. Just a small treat, they said, we'll all eat them together. And on the count of 3, the soldiers put them in their mouths and bit down on what turned out to be balls of goat shit. Of course, he had been ready to die for his country, Rafi told her. To believe that one was willing to die for one's country was the bare minimum required to even enter into the selection process, though along the way there were many boys or men who discovered that they were too afraid to die or to suffer, who couldn't dissolve their fear so that it seeped out like an odor from the pores of their skin. And the moment this was detected, they were immediately disqualified. It was not until later, after Rafi was discharged from the army and fell in love, that he came to see the grotesqueness and absurdity of dying for one's country, of dying and also being willing to kill. In the back seat, their boys became quiet. The oldest one, the only one with a phone, had taken it out, and the others were leaning in to see. It had happened when he was an officer, during the years that Israel had occupied southern Lebanon. His unit was given the assignment to kill the Hezbollah leader in the region. Intelligence knew that every single day at 6:30 a.m. sharp, the Hezbollah chief left the house and got into his car, and their instructions were to rig the engine with a bomb. There were 15 men in Rafi's unit, and they were carried over the border by helicopter and dropped at a mountain hideout. At 10 p.m., they set out crawling down the mountain and through the fields. For 4 hours, they dragged themselves along on their stomachs until finally they arrived at the village. There was a UN convoy there, and the peacemakers were out laughing and drinking because the UN people are always happy, Rafi said. For them, it's just one long party. The unit slid past the UN tents on their stomachs and surrounded the house of the Hezbollah leader. As the officer of his unit, Rafi was positioned near the front door, and it was then lying on his stomach with his gun trained on it while the explosion specialist disappeared under the car that he noticed the pairs of children's shoes. 3 or 4 pairs lined up at the entrance, little rubber sandals just like he and his brothers used to wear on the Moshav when they wore shoes at all. No one had mentioned any children, though why should they have? Children had no value in the calculus of military operations or wars. And in all of his nearly 5 years in the army, no one had ever told him anything beyond what he needed to know, and he hadn't asked. About civilians, the question had only ever been, should you encounter one in your mission, what will you do? Of which the only 3 options were kidnap, kill, or let go, where no answer was right or good. And yet the fact that Rafi had not known about the children and now was lying 10 meters from their sandals disturbed him. At that moment, he felt a tap on his shoulder, and lifting his eye from the crosshairs of his gun, he saw the face of the explosion specialist, painted dark green like his. The specialist gave him the thumbs up. The bomb was in place, rigged to go off the moment the Hezbollah chief touched his foot to the gas pedal. Rafi signaled to his men to retreat, and for 4 hours they crawled back on their stomachs to the mountain hideout, where they collapsed in exhaustion. By then, it was close to the hour that the Hezbollah chief left his house every day and got into his car. An unmanned aircraft flew overhead and provided grainy footage of what was happening on the ground, and at 6:20, the unit gathered around the display monitor and waited. There on the screen was the house they had left 4 hours before, dark and still. First, it was 6:28, and 6:30, then 6:35, and nothing. 6:45, 7, 7:15, and still only that haunting stillness. What the fuck, someone said more than once, possibly many times. Intelligence had established that each day, without fail, at 6:30 a.m. sharp, the Hezbollah chief stepped out of his house and got into his car. So what was going on? 7:30 arrived and still nothing. Rafi radioed to the general of the Northern Command. Boxer to Code North, over, what's happening? Code North to Boxer, because Boxer was always the radio name of Rafi's position, the officer of the anti-terror unit. Code North to Boxer, stand by, over. Then just after 8, the door of the house opened and the whole family stepped out. Rafi, who was holding the monitor, felt himself grow cold. In the grainy picture, the father, the mother, and 3 children approached the car, opened the doors, and disappeared inside. The bomb was rigged such that turning the key in the ignition and engaging the engine activated it, but detonation occurred only at the first millimeter of movement on the gas pedal. At the first millimeter of movement, the car and all of its passengers would be blown to pieces. The door of the car closed, and now there passed a moment of stillness before the key was turned and the engine came alive. We have ignition, came the confirmation over the radio. The seconds that followed, as I remember them now, were the longest of my life, Rafi said. I sat watching and waiting in a state of complete and total horror. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5. And then after 10 seconds, the driver's door opened and the Hezbollah chief got out, bent over to look under the car, and pulled out a chicken. It must have been a family chicken, beloved enough that someone in the car would have asked about its whereabouts before they pulled away. Where is whatever her name was? Look, she's not there with the others. Or, I just saw so-and-so run under the car. She hates it when we leave. She always does this. Or whatever one of the kids piled in the back seat said the moment before their father applied the first touch of pressure to the gas, which would have exploded them all in an instant. Out came the chicken, Rafi said, and then the guy ducks down for a second, looks, straightens up, and orders everyone out of the car. All the doors flew open, the kids tumbled out with the wife, and everyone went back into the house. Around me, many of my soldiers were furious. All of that for nothing. The mission had failed. Our superiors were pissed off as hell. And him, she asked, how did he feel? The thing is, he said, that I can't remember. And the more time passes, the more I feel I need to know, but it seems I will never know. Whether I was relieved, whether I understood at that moment that the chicken had saved my life too, or whether I was no longer even an animal and had become a machine. That.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you. Everyone, please use your give a little round of virtual applause there for Nicole. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So beautiful. The Antibody has an affiliate store via bookshop.org, and Bookshop will direct your sale to the nearest independent bookstore, or if one is not nearby, they will funnel part of your sale to one. So please support our authors and support independent bookstores who need our help now more than ever. And you can find a link to purchase Nicole's collection, To Be a Man, up there, along with all the other books from tonight's reading, and find out how that story ends. Thank you again, Nicole. That was really cool. So great. All right, moving along. Our next reader of the evening is Jonathan Lethem. Jonathan is the author of 12 critically acclaimed novels, including The Fortress of Solitude and the National Book Critics Circle Award winner Motherless Brooklyn, and most recently, The Abyss. The Arrest. I'm thinking of the James Cameron movie because I'm thinking of this amazing machine tunneling up from under. Freudian slip. Jonathan's stories and essays have appeared in the New Yorker, Harper's, Rolling Stone, Esquire, and the New York Times, among many other publications. And Jonathan joins us tonight from California, where he teaches creative writing at Pomona College. Welcome, Jonathan. Everyone get those keys clacking, and welcome, Jonathan. You've got the microphone.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope so. Great. So nice to be with you here in the abyss. We're all in the abyss. It should be like the generic Freudian slip for everything. Just accidentally saying that we're in the abyss. So The Arrest, yeah, it's a novel that is about a strange near future moment when everything sort of collapses, and it isn't a violent enough transformation to call it post-apocalyptic. It's sort of post-collapse. There are all sorts of things I could say about it, but I want to read just actually something from the backstory of the book. There's a few flashbacks to the life of the viewpoint character and the problem character, the bad guy, the heavy. The viewpoint character is a former script fix-it guy, like a script doctor, a rewrite man in Hollywood. And his name is Sandy, but he thinks of himself now in this post-collapse world as Journeyman. So you'll hear him called Journeyman, and maybe addressed by other characters as Sandy. And the bad guy, the heavy in the book, is someone named Peter Todbaum, who's a major Hollywood player, a producer and packager and a manipulator extraordinaire, who hires his old college friend Todbaum to rewrite movies and to enable him, and also just kind of pays him to stay around and listen to his bullshit all the time. So Journeyman is like a Todbaum's paid sidekick. So this is a chapter from pretty deep in the book, but it's a flashback, like I say, to before the arrest, before the collapse happens. And this is a chapter where Journeyman and Todbaum are talking about a project that Todbaum is paying Journeyman to work on. And the chapter is called Post-Apocalyptic and Dystopian Stories. Oh, and they have a project together that's a kind of meant to be like a science fiction Game of Thrones. It never happens. It's just a pie in the sky thing, but they're constantly working on it, which is a giant project for cable TV, or for quality TV, called Yet Another World. It's meant to be this giant futuristic panorama, and that's what they're supposed to be working on the day of this conversation. Post-apocalyptic and dystopian stories. If Journeyman was an expert in one thing, it was post-apocalyptic and dystopian stories. Reading them to pillage riffs and motifs for Yet Another World had been his paid homework for decades in the time before the arrest. Paid by Todbaum, that's to say. Todbaum hadn't only been outsourcing his research, however, he'd read the books too. You know what's great about this shit, don't you? He'd once asked Journeyman. They sat in Todbaum's Venice Boulevard office, headquarters of his production company, Kill Tree, control room for the vehicle he piloted before the blue streak. With this question, he gestured at the books strewn everywhere, pages stuffed with Post-its and striped by hot pink and canary highlighters, many laid open on their faces. More than once, Journeyman had witnessed Todbaum physically hacking a chapter from the bindings to place in the hands of Journeyman or some other alphabet monkey he'd hired to adapt the stolen material into a scene. The strange thing, the very most Todbaumist thing, was that he always insisted his assistant buy first editions for his raw material. The best copies, dust jackets intact. Then he'd slough off the jackets to be trampled. He'd say he liked the smell and feel of the original editions. Yet, once acquired, these books were all doomed. Journeyman had once reached to shift Cat's Cradle from an oozing pool of spilled cola. Todbaum laughed sharply. Look at you, Sandman. You feel sorry for the books, don't you? That day, Journeyman had come to report on Walter Tevis's Mockingbird. Journeyman said he didn't think it was a movie. Todbaum only grunted. Very likely this hadn't been his hope. More, he wanted to load Journeyman's mind with examples to pillage for Yet Another World. Tevis's book, Earth Abides, Dr. Blood Money, Station 11, A Canticle for Leibowitz, Ridley Walker, Vonnegut, Atwood, King. These, sprawled around this office, these were the shit Todbaum had in mind. No, tell me, what's so great about this shit? Journeyman said. It's always better, not worse, said Todbaum. What do you mean? Said Journeyman. You people are supposed to, write it to keep it from happening, right? Cautionary tales. In Todbaum's mind, Journeyman might be answerable for all writers, his tribe. But they can't help it, continued Todbaum. They like it there. They love it there. Where? Where? Said Todbaum. Whatever fucked up allegorical hellscape or dire prison block for the human soul they're working through. The particulars don't matter. They want to live there. You can feel it. The characters in the book, they're always justified, set out on a road. Speaking of which, the road, that one bugs the fuck out of me. It's supposed to be this existential Beckett deal, right? Grown-up apocalypse. But what's the worst old Cormac can think of? The basement scene, right? They keep those people alive so they can strip the flesh off them to eat. But the thing no one ever mentions? You'd have to feed those people to keep them alive. There's no point to it. If McCarthy were honest, he'd admit he wrote a campfire story. Instead, he inserts all this Old Testament horseshit. The world reduced and cleansed, the ambiguity scrubbed out. Because it's easier, suggested Journeyman. Sure, said Todbaum. Post-apocalyptic comfort food. I'm not talking about dime store fiction. Even Kafka wanted to go live in the castle. I bet you good money. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, suggested Journeyman. Sure, said Todbaum. Who doesn't like comfort? And who doesn't like food? Not me, said Journeyman. There you go, Sandy. There you go. Now, write my show just like that. A post-apocalyptic, dystopian, pastoral, meet cute. The old song we all long to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Oh my God, a post-apocalyptic, dystopian, pastoral, meet cute. Wonderful. I love it so much. Everyone, please give some love to Jonathan there in the chat. That's The Arrest. The Arrest. You can read it in the abyss. It's so wonderful.
Now playing in the abyss.
Right. It's like where we all seem to be playing these days.
The Abyss Multiplex.
I put that link up there one more time for you guys. If you to purchase books, please support our authors. It's really wonderful. Thank you. And yes, Kim Brockley mentions, shout out to Station 11 there. Some classic post-apocalyptic stories getting a shout out in that passage. All right, moving along to our final reader of the evening, Ayad Akhtar. Ayad is a playwright and novelist. He is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Among other honors, Ayad is the recipient of the Steinberg Playwriting Award, the Nestroy Award, the Erwin Piscator Award, as well as fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, MacDowell, the Sundance Institute, and Yaddo, where he serves as a board director. Additionally, Ayad is a board trustee at New York Theater Workshop and Pan America, where he will serve as the president beginning in December of next month, December 2020. And his latest novel is Homeland, Elegies. Please get those fingers tapping and keys clacking and give a warm welcome to Ayad Akhtar. Ayad, you've got the mic.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of my book, from the opening. It's called Overture to America. Doesn't need any context. I had a professor in college, Mary Maroney, who taught Melville and Emerson, and who the once famous Norman O. Brown, her mentor, called the finest mind of her generation. A diminutive, cherubic woman in her early 30s with a resemblance to a Raphaelesque Puto that was not incidental. Her parents had immigrated from Urbino. A scholar of staggering erudition who quoted as easily from the Eddas and Hannah Arendt as she did from Moby Dick. A lesbian, which I only mention because she did often. A lecturer whose turns of phrase were sharp as a German paring knife, could score the brain's gray matter and carve out new grooves along which old thoughts would reroute, as on that February morning, 2 weeks after Bill Clinton's first inauguration, when, during a class on life under early American capitalism, Mary, clearly interrupted by her own tantalizing thought, looked up from the floor at which she usually gazed as she spoke, looked up and remarked almost offhandedly that America had begun as a colony, and that a colony it remained, that is, a place still defined by its plunder, where enrichment was paramount and civil order always an afterthought. The fatherland, in whose name and for whose benefit the predation continued, was no longer a physical fatherland, but a spiritual one, the American self, long trained to worship its desires, however discreet, however banal, rather than question them, as the classical tradition taught. Ever tumescent American self-regard was the pillaging patria, she said, and the marauding years of the Reagan regime had only expressed this enduring reality of American life with greater clarity and transparency than ever before. Mary had gotten into some trouble the previous semester for similarly bracing remarks about American hegemony in the wake of Desert Storm. A student in the ROTC program taking her class complained to the administration that she was speaking out against the troops. He started a petition and set up a table in the student union. The brouhaha led to an editorial in the campus paper and threats of a protest that never actually materialized. Mary wasn't cowed. After all, this was the early 90s, and the consequences of astringent ideological fire and brimstone or sexual abuse of power while you're at it were hardly what they are today. If anybody had a problem with what she said that afternoon, I didn't hear about it. The truth is, I doubt many of us even understood what she was getting at. I certainly didn't. Worship of desire, tumescent self-regard, a colony for pillage. In her words was the power of a great negation, a corrective to a tradition of endless American self-congratulation. It was new to me. I was accustomed to the God bless light of the world exceptionalism that informed every hour I'd ever spent in history class. I'd come of age in the era of the hilltop city gleaming for all to see. Such were the glorified tropes I learned at school, in which I saw not as tropes, but truth. I saw an American benevolence in Uncle Sam's knowing glare at the post office, heard an American abundance in the canned laugh tracks on the sitcoms I watched with my mother every night, felt an American security and strength as I pedaled my 10-speed Schwinn past split-level and two-story homes in the middle-class subdivision where I grew up. Of course, my father was a great fan of America back then. To him, there was no greater place in the world, nowhere you could do more, be more, have more. He couldn't get enough of it, camping in the Tetons, driving through Death Valley, riding to the top of the Arch in St. Louis, before hopping a riverboat down to Louisiana to fish for bass in the bayou. He loved visiting the historic sites. We had framed our photos of trips to Monticello and Saratoga and to the house on Beale Street in Brookline, where the Kennedy brothers were born. I recall a Saturday morning in Philadelphia when I was 8 and father scolding me for whining through a crowded tour of rooms somehow connected to the Constitution. And when it was over, we took a cab to the famous steps at the museum and he raced me to the top, letting me win in homage to Rocky Balboa. Love for America and a firm belief in its supremacy, moral and otherwise, was creed in our home, and one my mother knew not to challenge, even if she didn't quite share it. Like both Mary's parents, as I would later learn from Mary herself, my mother never found in the various bounties of her new country anything like sufficient compensation for the loss of what she'd left behind. I don't think mother ever felt at home here. She thought Americans materialistic and couldn't understand what was so holy about the orgy of acquisition they called Christmas. She was put off that everyone always asked where she was from and never seemed bothered that they had no idea what she was talking about when she told them. Americans were ignorant not only of geography, but of history too. And most troubling to her was what she thought connected to all this disregard of important things, namely the American denial of aging and death. This last irritation would yield a malevolent concretion over the years, a terror-inducing bête noire that saw her to her grave, the thought that growing old here would mean her eventual sequestering and expiration in a home that was nothing like one. My mother's views, however rarely voiced, should have prepared me to understand Mary's dyspeptic take on this country, but they didn't. Not even my Islam prepared me to see what Mary saw, not even after 9/11. I remember a letter from Mary in the months following that terrifying day in September that changed Muslim lives in America forever, a 10-page missive in which she encouraged me to take heart, to learn what I could from the trouble ahead, confiding that her struggles as a gay woman in this country, the sense of siege, the unceasing assaults on her quest for wholeness, the roughness of her route to autonomy and authenticity, that all these had been but fires beneath her crucible, provoking creative rage, tempering sentimentality, releasing her from hope in ideology. Use the difficulty, make it your own, was her admonition. Difficulty had been the flintstone against which her powers of analysis were sharpened, the how and why of what she saw, but which I still wouldn't truly see with my own eyes for 15 years to come, my deepening travails as a Muslim in this country notwithstanding. No, I wouldn't see what Mary saw until I'd been witness to the untimely decline of a generation of colleagues exhausted by the demands of jobs that never paid them enough, drowning in debt to care for children riddled with disorders that couldn't be cured, and the cousins and the best friend from high school who ended up in shelters or on the street, tossed out of houses they could no longer afford, and until the near dozen suicides and overdoses of 40-something childhood classmates in the mere space of 3 years, and the friends and family medicated for despair, anxiety, lack of affect, insomnia, sexual dysfunction, and the premature cancers brought on by the chemical shortcuts for everything from the food moving through our irritable bowels to the lotions applied to our sun-poisoned skins. I wouldn't see it until our private lives had consumed the public space, then been codified, foreclosed, and put up for auction, until the devices that enslaved our minds had filled us with the toxic flotsam of a culture no longer worthy of the name, until the bright pliancy of human sentience, attention itself, had become the world's most prized commodity, the very movements of our minds transformed into streams of unceasing revenue for someone, somewhere. I wouldn't see it clearly until the American self had fully mastered the plunder, idealized and legislated the splitting of the spoils, and brought to near completion the wholesale pillage, not only of the so-called colony, how provincial a locution that seems now, but of the very world itself. In short, I wouldn't see what she saw back then until I'd failed at trying to see it otherwise, until I'd ceased believing in the lie of my own redemption, until the suffering of others aroused in me a starker, clearer cry than any anthem to my own longing. I read Whitman first with Mary. I adored him. The green leaves, the dry leaves, the spears of summer grass, the side-curved head, ever avid for what came next. My tongue, too, is homegrown. Every atom of this blood formed of this soil, this air. But these multitudes will not be my own, and these will be no songs of celebration. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Ayad. That was amazing. Everyone, give some love to Ayad Akhtar there in the comments. It's Homeland Elegies. That was fantastic. I'm going to put that bookshop link up here one more time, so you guys can do some shopping when this is done. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, all of you, and to you guys out there in the audience. We've got some time for a few questions. So if you've got some questions for the authors, I hope that you do. You can please use the chat, and we'll take them as they come in. Whoa, Ian, quick on the draw there. I like that. A question for Jonathan, and maybe we can spin this somehow for everybody here. Jonathan, did you encounter resistance from editors and publishers to writing literary sci-fi, especially early in your career? And if so, do you have any advice for overcoming the reluctance to mix and bend genres by a publishing industry that tends towards conservative choices? Thank you, Ian. That's Ian McCallan there from the Rumpus, bringing the literary take.
Thank you for the question. It's a big one. I mean, and my own personal experience is eccentric and interesting, and maybe not applicable, partly because it's time lost now. It's what happened to one person in the late 80s. But I felt, in a way, I was so passionate about writing things that confused genre boundaries that I was kind of, I wore it on my sleeve. I made it into the project. I announced it everywhere I went. And I tried to get people interested in the problem and make it not a problem, make it like an idea, an exciting idea. And so that sorted editors out very quickly, because a lot of them, of course, as your question supposes, were kind of allergic to it. And it wasn't only what you might say a kind of literary snobbish, top-down hierarchical allergy. There were editors in the field of science fiction who were presented with some of the things I was doing at the beginning and said, I remember the phrase was falls between the stools. Sounds very scatological. I was sort of like, between the stools, is that what I am? Between the I didn't know there were stools. But then again, other people seem to be exactly waiting for this, and I just wrote for them and talked to them. I mean, nothing you do is for everyone. I think I was very lucky. I came along after people like Raymond Chandler and Patricia Highsmith and Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard and Ursula Le Guin, and also, I saw, maybe perhaps willfully, but I saw international writing as a context that helped make sense of what I wanted to do, because there was Kobo Abe in Japan and Julio Cortázar from Argentina writing in Paris, and the Lipu writers, and there was Stanislaw Lem, published very prestigiously by Harcourt Brace, who became my first publisher, and it was Lem's translator who became my first editor. So I just kept talking about this stuff. I would just say, let's just do this, like, there's a context, come on. And so I willed it into being. But yeah, of course there was pushback, and there probably still would be, although I think readers are exhausted by that idea that there's a boundary. I don't think readers much care at all anymore.
To spin it a little different, Nicole, for you, you've published 4 novels, and this is your first collection. And this collection feels so intentional in its conception, at least as I'm reading it. The stories so wonderfully echo one another and feel a piece. Why at this point? Why now? Why a short story collection instead of another novel? And was there resistance in a career fashion of your own from editors or agent or whatever who were like, well, can you make this into a novel?
Well, why stories? I think in part because I just come at everything backwards. So I was writing poetry from like 15 until I was 25. And then I sat down one day and I had a boyfriend who was writing a novel. And I thought, well, if he's trying to do that, maybe I'll try to do that, because that seems like a better life than writing poetry, which is a really hard life to have. So I sat down and wrote a novel, and I loved it. And I just totally fell in love with the novel form. And then that engaged me for all these years. And will go on engaging me, because a novel, because it's so large and so ultimately formless, it really, every single time you sit down to write one, there's an invitation to redefine the form and reinvent it. And I think that's just kind of forever thrilling. And I will want to go on doing that. But then at some point, I guess after about 3 novels, I started to write some short stories, and just found an enormous pleasure there. And then, so the stories in this collection are almost entirely written right before my last novel, Forest Dark, and then I completed the collection afterwards. There's one exception, which is the one short story I wrote when I was younger, back right after 9/11, after I finished my first novel. So that's called Future Emergencies. And the emergency in that story is still ongoing. I won't say more. But otherwise, I just, for me, the question of like whether it's poetry or a novel or a short story, I know this is going to sound a little bit naive or silly, but it's almost irrelevant to me. It's just a question of like how long I have on the stage, like before I'm like pulled off with a cane. But the effort feels to me like continuous, just like different sets of goals or skills or different risks I can take or a different kind of playfulness in each one. But I actually just loved writing this collection, which I can't say is always the case. I suffered through a lot of my novels, even though I enjoyed writing them.
Put a pin in that. That's an interesting.
I cried through it because I never thought I would ever get them to finally work all together. But a short story, if it doesn't work out, doesn't work out.
And what about you? What's the in terms of writing plays and also writing narrative fiction and novels, how even like some of the pieces in Homeland Elegies read so much like monologues, like even the one you read. I mean, like how do you decide what's where you're gonna put your energies today, whether you're working on a play or working on a novel? How does that kind of come together for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I still don't have an answer. I get asked that a lot. I'm not sure I have an answer for it. Ideas just sort of come to you, and then they feel more appropriate in one form or another. Writing a play is hard because the formal demands are enormous. Everything has to happen through the dialogue of characters. And so that just forecloses certain options. Certain things you just can't do. You can't have people speak a certain way, or you can't get away with it if you've got any self-respect. So it just means that there are certain things that, if you want to, I suppose if you really want to be more ambitious formally or something, I suppose you could break that open, but that's not really the kind of writer I am. And so writing in a novel form, as Nicole was just saying, you reinvent it every time. I mean, it is a formless, shapeless thing. And there are conventions and there are sort of models that we all espouse. I'd love to write I wish I had written Pride and Prejudice, right? So there is a certain kind of formal unity that I'd like to pursue, but by the same token, if you want to do something big and free, then I think the novel is an easier place to do that. So.
I want to kind of, Cobra has asked a question here. I want to kind of give it a little spin, and maybe Ayad, you could start, which is, are you either specific to theater or television or movies? Are there pop culture? Are there things that you're watching or dramatic narratives that you're consuming?
No, but just in both of those books, you've got the character of Todd Baum. I'll call him a producer. I said mocker, but producer, and the character Mike Jacobs. And Ayad's book is a player in the entertainment industry as well. I'm just wondering, the series is predicated that we're trying to get through this pandemic. How will pop culture entertainment contribute to that? Because both of those characters in your books are in the entertainment world, and I'm just wondering if they could speak to that.
Well, I'll just say briefly, I think the entertainment world is struggling to figure out how to monetize the pandemic. I mean, there was enough content to last folks for a while, and then they were all in post-production basically by July, and they didn't really have anything new in the docket. So all the stuff we're seeing now is stuff that was shot obviously pre-pandemic, though production starting up again. But I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that I think there's going to be a quarter of the people who don't have jobs from a year ago in Hollywood. I mean, that's just the reality of what the pandemic has done. So, Jonathan.
I don't know how to answer it. I mean, it's such an interesting question. It might be a really good time for animation. I always think there ought to be more animated films like the Rick Linklater movies, Waking Life, and so now let's try that. There was an amazing one, based on a Stanislaw Lem story called the Congress, based on the Futurological Congress. I mean, there's always like one of those every 5 years. Why don't we have like 20 grown-up animated films all of a sudden? But more generally, I think that the uneasy relation that novelists have to the presence of this storytelling monster that it kind of squats in the middle of everything. It's an interesting time if that situation has been, like so many other things, kind of frozen by this the peculiar, this disaster is ongoing and it changes and it's rolling, but there's also a very stopped quality to a lot of things, and you sort of things are like sitting there for you to look at differently. And I think the storytelling monster that we all are, kind of invite into our houses when we turn on, whatever the means is, Netflix or Amazon Prime. I mean, I'm still going to it myself, but you can kind of see it differently now. And I mean, I write about Hollywood producers because I'm afraid of them. But also, obviously, I have some sort of crush on the whole thing too. I've spent my whole life watching movies, so it's very complicated.
Nicole, what about you? Do you have, I mean, we've talked before about literary influences like Sebald, and I mean, in your last novel, Kafka played a role. I mean, are filmic narratives or television serial narratives an influence on you?
There are two stories in this book, this collection, that revolve around films. There's a story in the collection called Seeing Ershadi, and it's about, I don't know if anyone listening has seen Kiarostami's film Taste of Cherry, but it's a film I saw when it came out in the late 90s when I was a student in London, and it pretty much haunted me all these years. And so I guess I set about writing a story to kind of figure out that haunting. So this story is about, the narrator is a dancer, and she, spends her afternoons with her leg up, icing her ankle, and she just watches all of these films, and she sees Taste of Cherry, and she becomes obsessed with this actor who takes up the entirety of the film and every shot in the film. And the actor wasn't an actor. Kiarostami, this is sort of a legend about this film, Kiarostami did this very often as a director, but he saw this man, Humayun Arshadi, sitting in a car in Tehran in traffic, and knocked on his window and asked him to be in his film. And the film is about basically a man who's decided to kill himself. He's dug his grave on the side of his hill outside of Tehran, and he simply needs somebody to cover the grave after he's taken sleeping pills and, died. And no one will do that because that's akin to blasphemy in the Quran. And so it's the whole film is about him driving around looking for someone to do this. And so this man's face, the grief in this man's face is the entirety of this film, and it's extraordinary. And so she becomes obsessed with him. And I won't go on anymore, but so that whole film sort of like is the center around this story of a friendship between two young women spins. And then there's another story in the book called Amour, which the film itself, the Hanukkah film, is never mentioned, but in the title, I mean, it's never named, but in the title, but it takes place in a future refugee camp somewhere in America. And it's about this woman looking back on why she left the man she was going to spend her life with because she saw that film Amour. I don't know if anyone here loves that film as much as I do, or was also equally as haunted by it. But anyway, so a long way of saying that I think films have been hugely part of my life, and some of them get under my skin so much that I've had to work out what they mean to me in my own fiction.
Thank you. And thank you, Cobra. If anyone has any other questions, please drop them in there. We've got time for one or two more. I mean, I've got my question for all of you. The titles of these books are so important to them. I mean, I think that's probably always the case with novels, but especially these books, their titles seem really essential to kind of cracking them open. Can you talk a little bit about like when the title came to you, at what point in the project, and was that did it become a unifying kind of thing from the start or midway through, and then you kind of realized you had to go back and readjust? Jonathan, do you want to start?
I can start, sure.
Yeah.
I have a lot of legacy with retitling books. It's often the last thing that comes, like I have a placeholder title that I don't know is only a placeholder forever. And then at the very 11th hour, my editor will break it to me. There's, everything is great, but we've never liked your title. And I have to come up with another one. So a lot of my books have these, for me, very strongly embedded former titles that I still feel as the sort of the real title, hidden behind the one that they went out under. But The Arrest is one of only two that had the same title all the way. Like it was just locked in, and no one ever even spoke of it to me. It just seemed somehow it just belonged on the book. And the thing I was afraid of with The Arrest was that people would expect it to be some sort of reply song to Kafka's The Trial, and wanted to be disappointed or confused that it wasn't a kind of a Kafka riff. But no one raised that either. It's never been discussed until this moment.
What was the
it might
other...
not even really have a title.
What was the other book that had that you had the title from the start?
Girl in Landscape was always was called that from day one. And no one ever said a word. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Hey, Yad, what about you?
I've always had a tough time with titles. And I think titles for me end up being the sort of least rejected options. So I have a lot of titles and they kind of are vying for whatever. And the one that I've rejected the least tends to rise to the surface. And in this case, I don't know, there were maybe 12 or 15 titles that I was playing with. And, my agent and editor were also a part of that process. And this is where we landed. I think it's the right title. And there was something about home was always going to be in there. And I just worried Elegies was a little too highfalutin. But the book is, as you know, if you've read it, it's a little pretentious. So that highfalutin quality probably is good advertisement for what's in it. So, yeah. So.
I would say it's very smart, not pretentious.
I don't know. We're in America. I don't know the difference between smart and pretentious.
Well, Nicole, how about you? I mean, clearly you have a lot of titles in here, but why to be a man does feel like it's something you see going throughout.
Yeah. Well, I also have had similar wrestlings that Jonathan described with titles of my novels, and I've had many. Usually the title comes to me last, suffice to say, after I finish the book, and publishers have rejected other titles. But with this collection, the title came to me. I was riding the elevator up to see my publisher to tell them that I was going to write this collection of short stories. And I was thinking about how I was going to explain this. and the title came to me, and it was a long elevator ride, I should say in advance, because HarperCollins is in a tall building downtown. And so I started to think a lot about how, I thought about how, like, all my life as a writer, I've inhabited men equally as often as women. So male characters have populated all of my books, as have women, but more than just characters, like I've actually inhabited them. So I've written them from the first person, from within. And I've always been drawn to do that. And I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking about how at this stage in my life, like I've had just an enormous amount of experience in the world with people. I expect to have a lot more, but still you like get to your mid 40s and a lot of things have happened to you. And a lot of that has been with men, like father, brother, husband, lovers. And now I'm raising two boys who are on the cusp of becoming men, hopefully a little bit from now. They're still adolescents, but one day. And I was thinking about all that experience, and I was thinking about what it means to raise boys now, especially, who have this enormously difficult task of trying to understand all the paradoxes and complications and ellipses that are involved in the expectations of manhood. And so I just thought I wanted to write a collection that somehow could like hold all of that, or look at all of that in some way with tenderness, like not to resolve any of the paradoxes or conflicts, but to hold them together. And so the title came to me, and that was what it was. And then what surprised me was, I think I had about 4 stories when I came up with that title. And the remaining stories, so out of 10 stories in the book, 7 of them are narrated by women or told from a kind of women's perspective. So this is very much a book about women equally as much as men, but both.
Well, it's lovely, and all 3 of these books are so beautiful and so smart, and also just so entertaining as well. I mean, I say that not in a offhanded way, but at this time period, especially, attention spans are challenged, and I've had no trouble slipping into all 3 of these. So this has been really, really wonderful to hear the 3 of you read from your work. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the audience out there. Please give another little digital round of applause for our readers, please. The Antibody has one more show in 2020, our 25th show. I'll put it up here. In 2 weeks, on Thursday, December 3rd at 7 p.m., Matthew Dodonna will be reading from his debut poetry collection, House of Sound. Hafiza Jeter will be reading from her poetry collection, Un-American. And Jialu Kwa will be reading from her novel, A Lover's Discourse. That's at 7 p.m. on Thursday, December 3rd. A big thank you once again to Ayad and Nicole and Jonathan. And thank you to such a great audience, and thanks to the Literary Hub. This will be archived on their virtual book channel. Until next time, everybody, stay healthy and stay optimistic and keep reading books. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks guys. This is such a pleasure.